Good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Janelle Perkins Muhammad, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist here in the Low Country area. So I'm licensed in South Carolina, Florida, North Carolina, and Georgia. And I think it's important for you to understand why I've come to this particular space. So I grew up in ministry and my parents were ministers. And what I found is for our community, the African American community, it's that we have an incredible grasp for the things that are spiritual in nature. So whether that's a matter of a hugging of a tree or you're believing in Jesus, one way or another, that spirituality is the depth of the connection that we make with one another. And so, what I found is that over the years, in watching my parents counsel individuals, both for marriage and for finance, that we had a lot of recidivism, a number of people who came back over and over again because they were experiencing the same challenges. So, I thought to myself, what is it that we're missing? And decided it made sense to go back to school and learn the theory behind some of the basic principles of how we would communicate to one another, how we connect emotionally with one another, and how that ties into the whole scope of our spirituality. And so I think when we are thinking in terms of what mental health is, oftentimes we get caught up as a community in the understanding that we have got to take things only to the altar and that there's nothing wrong with you, girl, you'll be all right. But when we talk about mental health, we have to understand what the definition is. It's the way that we emotionally, psychologically, and socially connect with everyone around us. So it's an integral part of health in and of itself. When you think in terms of the effect on how you think and feel and act, and you determine how stress impacts your life, your body, how you connect with your mama, your daddy, your sister, your brothers, your aunties, your cousins, and even the play ones that exist in the neighborhood, then we have to think about what that health looks like. So we go back to what is the emotional, the psychological, the social ways in which we connect as a part of our mental health, and recognizing that it changes over each stage of our lives. It still exists. So from childhood to adolescence to adulthood, we understand that health and mental health go hand in hand. So there's a difference between mental health and mental illness. Now, mental illness is that condition that is disruptive to the way that you think and you feel and you function in your daily life and the ability to relate to others. Because this is all about mental health and relationships. How do we connect with the people around us? And how is it impacted by our mental health? So, mental illness are those conditions that reduce your ability to cope with the routines of your day. Sometimes raising a family can become really challenging and really difficult. So, understanding that from one day to the next, it might not be a problem. But if it's ongoing and long term, then we have to think about it a little bit differently. Then we look at mental wellness. Now, you know, my philosophy is the greatest generational wealth that we can bestow is emotional and mental wellness. Because otherwise, you leave $1 million and it's blown in no time flat. Why? Because we're trying to find coping skills for life. So, mental wellness means that your mind is in order and functioning at its best capacity. So you're able to think clearly, you feel things still, your emotions still exist, and they're better regulated. So you might not fly off the handle and be angry and be disappointed as often or feel sadness for extended periods of time, but rather you're able to clarify what the feeling is. Is it truly anger or is it sadness? Would you respond differently if it were sadness over anger? And so when we think about the impact that has on our physical and our social well being, then we'd recognize the difference between mental wellness and mental illness. So let's look at relationships. So relationships really come into play when we consider that two or more concepts, objects, or people are connected. That's all relationship is. What is the connection between things? In this case, we're looking at familial relationships, and that could be fictive kin. You know, those people who have been your mom's best friend for the longest time, and now they're aunts and uncles or cousins that come from those relationships. So relationships can be by blood or by marriage or just by adoption. Those are all relationships. Now, it's also the way two or more people regard one another and behave toward one another. That's relationship. At work, you have a relationship with your boss. You might have a relationship with the secretarial pool. There's the executive staff. They all have a relationship. And then there's a relationship that flows up and down the chain of command. Regardless of the entity or organization that you're part of, there's always at some level a chain of command. Then relationship also is a matter of the emotional or sexual connection between two people as well. So that's more along the lines of what is the level of intimacy that exists within those relationships. So sometimes I liken this to imagining what it looks like within a family, right? So you remember the Cosby Show. We're not going to get into any controversy as it pertains to that, but it's a great example of what families can look like, right? So we had Cliff and Claire, the parents within the family, and then we had Vanessa and Sandra and Denise and Theo and Rudy. And that was, for a long time, the core of the family relationship. And you remember there were all kinds of things happening. There were incredible arguments. And one time, I think it was Denise, who made Theo a shirt that was quite interesting, to say the least. And so when we think about that being the nucleus of the family relationship and their mental health and their well-being and how that connected them, sometimes it was splintered and they just didn't get along very well. Other times it was very congruent and everything just kind of flowed. And it's interesting because as they pulled in other individuals, boyfriends, girlfriends, cousins that came to live with them, we found that we eventually had Elvin. You remember when Claire met Elvin and she got him a cup of coffee? That again is a matter of their mental wellness, because Claire understood who she is and how she functioned, and a little bit of a cognitive distortion that was happening with Elvin because he had grown up in a family where he wasn't quite sure what the relationship status should be between a man and a woman and who was going to be subservient to another. Then we also had Martin, and Olivia came to live with them at one point, and Pam came to be a part of the family. So when we consider that in everything we do, there is a relationship, a connection in one way or another that gives us an opportunity to check our own mental wellness and our own mental health. And what we want to be able to do through understanding how mental health and mental illness impacts the relationship is to remember that there are times, even within those familial relationships or work relationships, where stigma comes to play. And the idea of this particular class is to remove that stigma. So I'd ask you, if you define stigma, what would that look like? So our definition is a mark of disgrace or shame. So the perceived negative attribute that causes someone to devalue or think less of themselves or others thinking less of them as a whole person, the entirety of the person. And what stigma ends up doing is labeling, it's stereotyping, It's discriminating against one another, having a level of ignorance about what is happening within the individual that brings you to a place where now you have a prejudice. And sometimes we use words that stigmatize on a regular basis, and we don't even think about it. And there are studies that have been done that demonstrate that words like psycho and they're cray cray, we say that a lot, is, someone is cray cray, or OCD, not realizing that that's stigmatizing in many ways. And that stigma, as a result, becomes a way of isolating individuals. And now they have no space that's safe, that they can express the challenges that they're experiencing. They may even find themselves losing friends and maybe not able to stay on course with future plans of education or moving into a career or even being in a marital relationship. It lowers the self-esteem, and sometimes it brings people to a place where the stigma completely moves them into a different level of mental illness. So it's important that we consider and understand that pre-pandemic, we were looking at 1 in 5 who were living with a mental health condition. And then post-pandemic, we've moved closer to 1 in 4. And 1 in 25 Americans have a serious mental illness that at some level is impacting their relationships at work, in their families, and in their community. And it's so important to recognize that oftentimes we take the opportunity to say things like those stigmatizing labels I just expressed, and they are not appropriate in any situation, because the number of times that you think of someone as being schizophrenic or bipolar, you have to think about what the course of the nation is, right? How many people actually would be living with those conditions? And schizophrenia is very low in percentage. So we're talking about 0.3% of adults each year are living with a schizophrenic episode. And generally speaking, someone who has schizophrenia only has 1 episode in their life. And then they've learned to manage and to cope with the illness. And you may really be working next to someone who has a mental illness like schizophrenia, but they also have it under control. So we have to be so careful about how we are exchanging dialogue around mental health and mental illness. I think the final thing that I'll say that I think is truly important for the African American community is to recognize that we make up somewhere in the neighborhood of about 14% of the US population. And of that 14%, approximately 16% of African Americans have been diagnosed with a mental health condition. So when we think about that, we're talking about, let's say, the cities of Chicago, Philadelphia, and Houston. All the population of those 3 cities, that's 6.8 million-ish that are diagnosed in the African American community with a mental illness. So as we're considering how we function and how we relate with one another, how we connect both cognitively, emotionally, spiritually, physically connect with one another, how intimate we become in that connection of vulnerability, we need to also be thinking about how do we ask the question about mental health and mental illness that allow us the opportunity to destigmatize those conditions such that the same treatment and care and love you'd give for a broken arm, you'd also do for someone who is living with anxiety. I'm Dr. Janelle Perkins Muhammad, and I'm so grateful for having the opportunity to come before you today and do this talk. Take care.